Esports, or competitive online multiplayer video games, have become big business.
Over 50,000 people are going to come and watch them here this weekend at the Spodek Arena, and there's a predicted audience who are going to watch online of over 20 million people.
Sports. Since time immemorial, men, women and children have sought to outdo one another in a competitive setting. Whether it be with balls and bats, just balls, or no balls at all, we have created a vast amount of games that, from their humble roots, have grown into multi-billion-dollar industries all across the globe. Each sport lifting up their champions, athletes among the human race at the very pinnacle of their game, lauded and heralded by those who covet their prowess. We all know what sports are. Many love them, many loathe them. However, watch what happens when I make one simple addition to the word.
It's still not a sport.
I'm laughing because I can't think of anything less interesting.
Have you guys seen esports and the E-League? I don't know if that's sports.
Video games pretty much is definitely challenging.
Yikes.
He treats it like a full-time job, like a serious athlete.
There's also the thing of like you actually being an adult and having to go to work and pay bills and not spend all your time training.
I mean,
With your coach.
Pandemonium, disbelief, fervor, denouncement. Such is the reaction from multiple sources of media to the phenomenon known as esports and the new form of athlete they are presented with. Now, esports, for the uninitiated, refers to electronic sports, a grouped term for competitions of skill played out in various video games. The players of said games are professional and play either as a team or as an individual, all in an effort to become the best of the best in their fields. And to say it's popular would be an understatement. In certain countries around the world, these competitors are or are becoming household names, their follower counts rising day by day in the millions. And speaking of, this section of gaming culture has gradually grown its way up to becoming a superpower, drawing in millions, billions of revenue, thousands of people watching their favorite players on the biggest stages across the entire globe. The younger generation starting to look more closely at these players, idolizing them and honing their own abilities in their own favorite games to become the next gaming sensation. But this picture of glory and success in esports hasn't always been the case. In fact, the journey the industry has taken to get to this point has been littered with ridicule, misunderstanding and a certain degree of dismay. The tale of esports has its humble beginnings, as most things do. The tale begins in the year 1972, October 19th, within the walls of Stanford University's AI lab in Los Altos, California. Here, a movement was about to be born. Stuart Brand, a 33-year-old editor and writer working with the ever-popular Rolling Stone magazine, had an idea for a new story. He would write about the impact computers, still in their commercial infancy, were to have on the creative process and society at large. A former sports reporter, Brand now turned to evidencing his claims by forming a tournament of star athletes, all of them at the very forefront of their expertise and training. But instead of racket and ball, the instruments of glory were to be joysticks and controllers. Now, at the time, while home computers were still in their teething phase, video games had yet to utter their first word to the world. This was well before the era of the well-known Pong game, and as such, many people hadn't ever had the slightest inkling of video games' existence in their entire lives. But Brand had travelled throughout America, visiting various research institutions at varying universities, and the one constant presence in each lab, young engineers crowded around a small computer playing the video game called Space War, a title developed in 1962 to showcase the potential power of computers. Space War saw two players going to war in space. There would be one ship for each player that could fire to torpedoes at the other, controlled through a basic set of buttons and a switch, with players being able to get boosts to their shot from the ever-present star. Its minimalist design had not had an effect on its popularity even after a decade. Players across the country would still be engrossed in its competitive nature, something Brand sought to exploit. On October 19th, Brand put his plan into motion. The writer convinced the lab to shut down for the night and invited students and researchers to take part in the inaugural event he titled the Intergalactic Space War Olympics. Beer and snacks in good supply being provided. Around 50 students would gather for the event. Now, computers since Space War's release had improved, and to show this off, the tournament would consist of 2v2 player rounds, each player playing at the same time before moving on to the final, a 5-player free-for-all to decide the world's very first esports champion. Each of the 5 final players locked their eyes onto the screen and readied their strategies. The game was intense as players shouted obscenities at their ships and their competition, but by the end there was one clear winner. In what Brand would describe as a powerhouse performance, Bruce Baumgart, a skilled and notorious Space War player who had actually extensively trained for the day, obliterated his competition. Baumgart was the very first champion. His prize? A month's subscription to the Rolling Stone magazine, of which Brand wrote the story for. A relatively humble prize for such a feat, but yet it wasn't the physical reward that was the point. It was rather the chance to be the best in an area that one trained for. This was the very moment that proved a video game could become something akin to a sport. The ensuing article Stuart Brand wrote of the event was, of its time, self-aware and hyperbolic, but you can tell he really thought or knew that he was at the precipice of something truly special. From there onwards, the esports movement exploded into the public consciousness and was taken and ran with by a certain country and company from the East. Yes, Japan and Sega had taken a massive bite out of the esports cherry. In 1974, they would hold a nationwide arcade video game tournament dubbed the All Japan TV Game Championships. To help advertise and promote their video games, Sega sponsored the affair, which was comprised of local tournaments in 300 distinct locations across the whole of Japan. The final, held in Tokyo, saw 16 skilled combatants compete in elimination rounds. The prizes consisted of TVs, a major deal at the time, radios, and cassette tape recorders. Esports in the East had well and truly taken off. Back in the States, the Gremlin Girls had arrived in 1977. The girls, Sabrina Osmond and Lynn Reed, were professional arcade game players sponsored by Gremlin Industries to promote their new game, Hustle. The pair traveled to 19 different US cities, accepting any challenges. 1,300 players answered their call, with only 7 managing to beat the duo. The Gremlin Girls had arguably become the very first professional gamers, a major step but seldom publicized. Another major step came the following year with the addition of leaderboards, which would track a player's high score, a feature made popular by 1978's Space Invaders from company Taito. A groundbreaking game to many, Space Invaders' high score system was implemented in many times that came after, the title even becoming the subject of the earliest huge-scale video game competition at that time. Yes, in 1980, the Space Invaders Championship, organized by Atari, drew in over 10,000 players across the US. The winner? 17-year-old Rebecca Hinneman, who would go on to be a game designer herself. At around the same time, gaming drifters came into existence, players who roamed from town to town, leaving mysterious high scores on every arcade machine in sight. It all sounds like this Ready Player One fantasy, but it's all real, I swear. Esports and competitive gaming had ceased to be a mere concept. Big companies such as Guinness World Records hosted competitions in the early 80s. From these came notoriety for the players. They were featured in Life and Time magazine and became minor celebrities. 10,000 people had come forward in 1980 to compete. In 1984, that number rose to 1 million for massive games companies Konami and Centuri's joint international track and and field arcade game competition. The players entered in their droves from both North America and Japan. Publicized as an event on a scale never before achieved in the industry, this competition represented a turning point for esports. The number of competitors was growing to staggering levels as gaming high scores and the lights of the arcade breached their way into pop culture. From blockbuster movies to hit television shows, seriously, it was everywhere. Competitiveness in gaming became commonplace, but the movement was still restricted by one major thing. You see, all these gaming tournaments and competitions had to be done mostly in person. Yes, you could compete using high scores, but a lot of them didn't even see 2 or more players going against each other directly. Bar a few events, small gatherings were the norm. And if you didn't live in the city, then you were simply out of luck. However, a couple of revolutionary developments to gaming as a whole were on their way. Developments that would shake the very foundations of esports. By the end of the 80s, more and more experimental progress was made with gaming in an effort to evolve the medium. One such idea that had been toyed with throughout the decade was the notion of online gaming. The idea that you can, from your own home, connect your gaming system to another in an effort to play the same game with someone not in the same room but from anywhere else in the world. In 1988, the third game to use such a feature, Netrec, introduced the idea of having an external server, which players from almost anywhere could connect with alongside others to play the game in the same lobby, something that would become commonplace in many online games since. Pair this ingenuity with the idea to incorporate one-on-one fighting games into the esports sphere in the early 90s, and you've got yourself a brand new way to hold mass competitions. Popular games of this genre like 1991's Street Fighter II were used as a means to stride away from competitive gaming's reliance on high score-based competition. Because of this, and much like how it all started, players could compete face to face, directly facing off against each other's face, an aspect which would be the basis for the many tournaments to come, and one that provided a dose of Hollywood drama to the spectacle. Esports tournaments with this new angle became prevalent, their scope expanding, exampled by the 1990 Nintendo World Championships holding its finals at Universal Studios, a second tournament's finals in San Diego. The scale was only increasing incrementally, yes, but esports during the 90s rode a never-ending, unstoppable wave of popularity. Online connectivity had changed most walks of gaming culture, not least in the PC gaming section, where you could now face off against the world's best players from the comfort of your own abode. Games like Doom and Quake leaning heavily into this feature. Esports was morphing into something that many people who were initiated into gaming knew of. Local competitions were more and more frequent, and more players joined in on the fight. However, in the West, it appeared this reluctance to go beyond this. That Konami track and field competition was still the largest event in history. We hadn't pushed the industry to greater heights. Perhaps there was a reluctance from mainstream media to actually go all in on broadcasting a major esports event. Perhaps society in the West had an idea of what people who were good at a video game were like, and it didn't quite fit in with the image they were going for. Whatever the reason, at this time, while esports here hadn't quite stagnated, it wasn't moving up the chain of popularity anymore. Online modes to games had ranking systems, but the esports or competition-based gameplay wasn't a priority for developers. In summary of the 90s for esports, the decade was all about advancements in technology, with esports lagging behind the curve. High-speed internet, after all, was still a commodity, but in the East, in one particular country, it was an entirely different story. It was to be in South Korea where esports finally found their developmental home. Largely in part to the 1997 Asian financial crisis, a multitude of broadband internet networks were built, while unemployment soared, and with it came desperate times and a need to distract oneself from them. Many South Koreans at the time turned to video games, using the plethora of internet cafes and specially designed LAN gaming centers known as PC bangs out there to do so. Today there are over 25,000 successful PC bangs in the country. South Korea had ridden the esports wave, and when that hype was coupled with tough financial years, esports and gaming became an incredible means of escape for the people. So influential influential were esports in the country at the time, a government association called the Korean Esports Association was established at the turn of the century in 2000. The association's aim to promote and regulate esports nationwide. For the first time in recorded history, a government and indeed a country had gone all in on esports. South Korea led the way, creating multiple television shows that were dedicated to showing off the exploits of the various players and teams in the nation. Competitors for the first time were considered real celebrities, the industry being compared to South Americans' love of soccer. Games such as StarCraft and Warcraft 3 were the subject of heated competitions. Slowly, esports began to become mainstream in the country, with Western television providers working to catch up. A few not so well known channels broadcasted the bigger tournaments here in the UK and across the rest of Europe and North America, though most were unsuccessful here after a brief period. There simply wasn't a target audience big enough to justify the upkeep of these channels and shows. During the mid to late 2000s, televised esports had very much stalled in their tracks here, which in turn caused esports growth to stutter, and yet the number of tournaments globally rose. In the year 2000, there were around about 10 major yearly esports competitions. By 2010, there were 260, and the prize pools kept rising also. Winners would receive TVs and radios in the 70s and 80s. Now though, if you were skilled enough, you could be walking away from a tournament with thousands of dollars, with a significant outlier being a winner from a 2006 tournament taking home a not too shabby $1 million grand prize. And if you want to see this grand occasion, well, you can't. At least I couldn't find it, and that's a shame, but it is indicative of the strange trend of esports in the 2000s. In some countries at this point, it was recognized at government level and displayed proudly on cable TV. In others, TV shows and channels were discontinued due to a lack of demand. While South Korea had made esports mainstream and accessible to potential viewers, the West hadn't followed suit. The industry was growing, but not at a rate that was seen in the East. So if it can't be shown on mainstream national TV with any success, then esports in the West had to subvert what the mainstream was, and it got its big break in 2011. A twitch is when your body seems to move sharply of its own accord, whereas Twitch is also a name of a huge streaming platform. In 2011, Twitch opened its doors and welcomed creators of all sizes onto its site. People began to use the service to stream themselves playing games with witty banter and commentary and strange, terrible things. Nevertheless, Twitch became a huge player in the streaming world and was, and still is, a completely different take on the live television content model. And yes, while it may have been for smaller content creators too, Twitch top dog Emmett Shear designed the site with esports broadcasting in mind. In Twitch, you have a way to appeal to millions and millions of potential viewers for free, much like YouTube at the time, but where they differed was that they focused more on live content. If you're a big company and want to promote your game or esports tournament, it's a no-brainer that you would go straight to Twitch. Live events have a different feel to them rather than watching highlights. There's a reason why people still pay for sports television packages, and many people agree with that sentiment. So with Twitch, esports in general finally found a place to call their own. And wow, they flourished. In 2013, Twitch viewers combined racked up 12 million watched minutes. The two most popular channels on there being two esports-focused games, League of Legends and Dota 2. The demand suddenly in this corner of the internet was there, and was further shown by the sheer size that events had grown to. One League of Legends tournament being held in a sold-out Staples Center. The following year, back in South Korea, the 2014 League of Legends World Championship was attended by over 40,000 in-person fans, with mainstream artists Imagine Dragons performing the music, with many more watching online. online. South Korea leading the way once more. Not to be outdone though, America since the mid-2010s has recognized esports players as being varsity level athletes, offering players entire athletic scholarships. In 2015, they even launched an esports arena in California, the United States' first dedicated esports facility. In fact, globally there was this rush and surge to not be left behind in this area. A mass rush to accommodate for this growing influence on media and entertainment, and indeed sport. And so year after year this trend continued. Esports gained more fans, more notoriety, the prize pools kept increasing. The amount of money being pumped into this industry right now is mind-blowing to say the least. Back in 2012, 1.3 billion hours had been spent watching these esporting events. In 2018 that number had quintupled to 6.6 billion hours. In the same year, the industry was worth $906 million, 694 of those millions being either direct or indirect brand investments, a 48% increase on the year prior. And the next year, in 2019, esports finally pulled in more than $1 billion, the total number of spectators swelling to around 443 million. And speaking of millions, let's take a look at the rise in the grand prizes for actually winning these massive tournaments. Let's take a popular esports tournament, Dota 2's The International for example. In 2015 their total prize pool had been $18.43 million, by 2019 $34 million, the final being watched by 1.1 million fans on Twitch alone. And that tournament isn't a mere outlier. Take Fortnite's World Cup finals in 2019, a player called Bugha securing $3 million for himself after winning the solo tournament, a sum more than tennis players get for winning the illustrious competition Wimbledon. And with this we see that the pattern is clear. This is a big deal and a huge money-making machine, one that is only going from strength to strength. Countries are now striving to put the infrastructure in place to produce the next perfect gaming team. Every major game developer has one eye on this community and a few minds within their walls working on the next title to be featured as an esport. Developers now actively encouraging this industry. It's quite incredible to me to research all of this and see the trajectory from a small competition in a Californian lab to sold out stadiums across the world. It's a journey filled with people gathering together to compete, with a section of these competitors being among the best and wanting to show that fact. Now if that isn't the exact same story as most established sports out there, then I don't know what is. And yet, esports players have ran into an incredible challenge. They find themselves in the tricky position where they have their detractors, their doubters, all of which ask the same biting question, said with a dismissive smirk curled upwards on their faces. Can esports ever live up to actual sports? Can these esports players ever get the same level of respect? Throughout the history we've worked our way through thus far, there has always been a rather controversial question being asked. Are esports an actual sport? Can esports players ever be considered athletes? Now, a lot of people from the mainstream sporting networks appear to be less than supportive of the idea. But why is this? Well, it could have its roots in sporting elitism, the notion that regular sports are better than any new age association purely because they are seen as being harder to compete for. I feel as though society has become overly conditioned to an image of the peak athlete, a muscled man or woman achieving vastly physical feats, or a body that is so specialized for that particular sport that it shows the level of dedication they put into their day-to-day lives. The fact that anyone else can perhaps not have to spend as much time working out and still be considered sporting superstars is an odd one to accept. But anyone stating that professional esports players are simply phoning it in with little to no effort are in themselves perpetuating a myth. Many esports players practice in multiple games for around 6 to 8 hours a day, usually either with their own professional teams or as an individual, working on synergy, strategy and reaction times. It's a repetitive process. Games, the same as most most sports are limited to their parameters, rules, and indeed the game's mechanics. So it's all about incremental gains, shaving off a millisecond to get to a certain area of the field, coordinated positioning, playing a game of chess with your opponent with millions of slight movements to consider. Esports are a sport of the mind then, but also of the body. Physical exercise is an important part of these players' lives, honing targeted areas of their bodies to increase their stamina. Yes, perhaps there was a time where esports players didn't have to do all of these things, but the industry is evolving, with everyone looking to gain an advantage over their fellow competitors. So you must adapt, you must practice, you must exercise or be insanely naturally gifted to just keep up. Such is the pressure that athletes are under, such is the pressure esports players are under. Both are industries of sacrifice, of dreams and hopes, of crushing failures and disappointments. Esports walks and talks like a sport. So do you consider it to be a sport? I'd like to genuinely know your thoughts. I'd also like to know whether you'd call these esports players athletes. Calling them anything otherwise seems disingenuous and unaware of their efforts to me. However, by definition and in the mainstream media, esports players are categorically not athletes. To become one, you must physically exert yourself within the confines of a sporting event. The definition of sport follows this model also. The rules and goalposts have always been against any thought of classifying esports and its stars as anything other than competitions and players. Time and time again, esports has been denied the chance to be reclassified, to be respected, being, in my opinion, shunted aside and placed into other categories such as cybersport in Russia, a formal recognition of esports being a separate entity to sports. But the decision to regard them as even that has yo-yoed between yes and no throughout the years. Discussions had taken place to allow various esports into the Olympics, but that only resulted in the International Olympics Committee rolling out the Virtual Olympic Series, a series where competitors battled it out in video games, but only games surrounding existing sports such as motor racing and so on. Another separated classification. Perhaps not helping their cause are disagreements within the esports community itself. Various fighting game associations breaking off from the argument, preferring to go by competitors and competition. The athlete label they feel is unnecessary. It's a real volatile issue that's likely to persist for years to come perhaps. And now we come to the present day. So where does all this leave esports in 2022? Well, while most people who are engrossed in internet culture have accepted the skill it takes to compete at such a high level, with many actually watching and supporting their favorite players, the mainstream has on the whole rejected esports. Especially in the West, we see more and more half measures, sidesteps, and unwillingness to accept that esports is a growing business that is becoming incredibly attractive to the younger demographic. What remains to be seen is whether mainstream media embraces the movement in any real way, attempts to use it to further the appeal of physical sports, or rejects it altogether. What we do know is something that has made itself clear to me over the course of my research. These players, titans, are leading the charge, championing an exciting and wholly new form of professional competition. The lines on whether they are to be considered true sportsmen and women are blurry, and continue to get more and more vague as the years go by. What these guys and gals are talented, driven, and passionate people. They should be and are somewhat recognized for their efforts. Whether they themselves are content with this reduced level of recognition is up in the air. When Stuart Brand first gathered together 50 students and researchers in a Californian lab to compete against each other in a video game, he saw the potential. Today he sees the rise of esports from that small lab to sold-out stadiums as being a perfectly reasonable outcome based on what he witnessed back in 1972, all those years ago. The medium has given us multiple incredible moments that are described in legendary terms. The whole story is fantastical, but somehow real. Pro gaming teams now live together, train together, win together. It's a subset of gaming that often inspires the next generation of stars, and yet it's been a battle ever since its inception to gain respect and praise from commentators outside of the gaming circle. Now, detractors exist in all walks of life, but it is in how we manage to deal with these detractors that holds the key as to whether or not we progress as a person, as an industry. Whether or not esports actually needs to eclipse the mainstream remains to be seen. They don't really have to appeal to anyone, they're rising up well enough on their own. Nevertheless, it appears as though it is only a matter of time before this ridiculed powerhouse of an industry becomes too big to denounce any longer. It may still take years for these campaigners to get the recognition they feel they deserve, but they're fighting the good fight. Maybe decades from now, these pioneers will be the reason for changing entertainment and sports as we know it. Or maybe it's all just a fad. Who knows? Anyhow, I've been Joshua, and this has been mostly the entire history of esports.